Edward, Duke of Kent, has just officially confirmed a sweeping change to the line of succession that absolutely nobody in the public sphere saw coming. And the chaotic, abrupt way this massive announcement went down has left the inner circle of the royal family frantically dealing with the exact kind of bitter, internal fallout that usually stays locked firmly behind closed doors. The absolute core of this entire ordeal isn't merely about who stands where on some dusty, archaic order of precedence. It is fundamentally about how a deep, private family wound regarding Prince Andrew got ruthlessly turned into formal constitutional machinery, and how the actual living people caught violently in the middle of it are now desperately trying to figure out if they can ever look each other in the eye again. Before we dive deep into the messy, granular details of this constitutional crisis, please do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button for my channel so you absolutely don't miss the next explosive update when this situation inevitably gets messier. Here is exactly where the narrative gets incredibly weird and highly revealing. The Duke of Kent, a man who has spent his entire, long adult life dutifully being the incredibly quiet, fiercely loyal cousin who absolutely never, ever causes a public scene, finally felt compelled to aggressively break his legendary silence. And the specific profound reason he spoke up is because the suffocating palace silence surrounding this issue was actively doing significantly more damage to the family's fabric than the harsh truth ever could. He formally confirmed that the royal family had officially, legally accepted a brand new emergency continuity structure. That is essentially a highly sanitized, fancy bureaucratic way of saying they deliberately drew up a brand new, legally binding list dictating exactly who gets to step up and hold the entire, massive institution together if there is a sudden, catastrophic crisis, a massive scandal, a debilitating illness, or something devastating that takes the reigning sovereign completely out of action. It sounds incredibly boring and dry on paper. Consequences for everyone in the family has been officially, legally moved ahead of Prince Andrew's branch in that critical emergency order. That specific move might sound entirely obvious and logical to absolutely anyone who has casually watched the royals operate for the last decade. Anne works constantly, flawlessly, and tirelessly. Andrew, disgraced and exiled, absolutely doesn't. But the ancient monarchy runs primarily on strict bloodlines and rigid tradition, absolutely not just on modern, corporate performance reviews. Deliberately moving Anne up the ladder explicitly means deliberately moving Andrew down, and that specific calculation is incredibly brutal because it cuts directly, violently through old, festering wounds involving Charles, Andrew, Edward, and highly specific promises made during the personal, targeted betrayal. King Charles apparently had absolutely no earthly idea exactly how far this bureaucratic process had progressed behind his back. He angrily sat down with Edward, firmly closed the heavy door, and pointedly asked exactly how long Princess Anne had intimately known about the change. That is the specific, piercing question that changed absolutely everything about the confrontation. He absolutely wasn't asking, "What does this mean legally?" or "Who exactly drafted the specific language?" He furiously wanted to know exactly who had been quietly, secretly preparing for this monumental moment long before he, the reigning king, was even fully briefed on its finality. And the hesitant answer revealed something incredibly uncomfortable for the monarch. Anne absolutely knew deep discussions were happening, but she fiercely insisted she never ever believed they had reached final, legal approval. She admitted she had heard serious continuity concerns voiced during the final, declining years of Queen Elizabeth II, but she firmly thought, and his sister is simultaneously learning that her own family branch has been permanently elevated without her ever explicitly asking for it, lobbying for it, or celebrating it. That specific twisted timeline absolutely doesn't add up or look clean for absolutely anyone involved in the mess. What makes this entire situation so deeply fascinating and emotionally complex is that Princess Anne is absolutely not happy about her massive promotion. By any normal logical standard, she absolutely should be. She has unarguably been the absolute most reliable, steadfast working royal for decades. She has dutifully carried out significantly more public engagements than almost anyone else in the entire firm. She absolutely never complains to the press and fiercely refusing to let Andrew's catastrophic mistakes erase their own rightful place in the institution entirely. Now, this cold, new legal arrangement strongly threatens to make that painful, creeping separation feel absolutely permanent and undeniable. Anne instantly, viscerally understands that implication. She can easily accept more crushing responsibility, but she absolutely cannot and will not accept the toxic idea that her beloved nieces had to be publicly humiliated and demoted in order for her to receive it. So, Anne deliberately waited until all the other courtiers and officials left the room and aggressively confronted Edward directly about the fallout. She tightly gripped the back of a heavy chair and fiercely told him absolutely not to let the palace PR machine turn this necessary constitutional move into a cheap, public victory lap over Andrew's vulnerable daughters. That is the exact poignant moment where dry, constitutional logic gets completely swallowed whole by raw, protective family emotion. Edward quietly admitted that this resulting PR nightmare was exactly what he had deeply feared from the beginning. The settlement was absolutely never, ever designed by the lawyers as a personal, triumphant reward for Anne's hard work. But once it inevitably became public knowledge, that is exactly, precisely how the voracious media would frame it. One sibling triumphantly rising while another completely falls in disgrace. The public would effortlessly strip away absolutely every complex, boring legal detail and eagerly turn it into something significantly simpler and infinitely uglier. And that is precisely, exactly what happened. To truly understand exactly why Anne fiercely feared this specific outcome so much, you absolutely have to go all the way back to the quiet, private conversation that originally started it all. It absolutely wasn't a loud parliamentary debate or a frantic reaction to a new public scandal. It was a deeply private, somber family conversation during the closing, reflective chapter of Queen Elizabeth's incredibly long reign. The late Queen had been intensely, pragmatically thinking about long-term stability, absolutely not about petty punishment. She deeply understood that a future sovereign could suddenly face a debilitating illness, a massive unforeseen scandal, sudden physical absence, or a massive national crisis with absolutely very little warning. She firmly believed that enough highly dependable, impeccably clean family branches had to remain legally ready to support the heavy crown at a moment's notice. That specific practical concern became infinitely harder to ignore as Andrew disgracefully withdrew from all public duties and Anne simultaneously carried an enormous, almost unsustainable daily workload. Edward clearly remembered the aging monarch's somber tone significantly more than her exact words. She absolutely didn't speak about Andrew with explosive, vindictive anger. She spoke about him with profound, heavy sadness, because she had painfully seen exactly how incredibly quickly a public scandal could completely weaken national confidence in a royal role that once appeared entirely secure and permanent. Anne actively resisted the changing direction of the conversation almost immediately, that her own reliability absolutely could not and should not become a blunt weapon used against relatives who had already endured immense public humiliation. She deeply understood duty significantly better than almost anyone else in the family, but she also intimately knew exactly what happens when cold, institutional language violently enters private, bleeding family wounds. She argued that if the crown started coldly measuring human worth and rank entirely by scandal and mere usefulness alone, the family would eventually, inevitably destroy itself completely from the inside out, all while falsely claiming to protect the monarchy. Then came the incredibly stark moment absolutely nobody in that room ever forgot. Elizabeth abruptly stopped a fictional, tabletop emergency planning exercise being held at Balmoral after the organizational chart clearly showed Andrew's branch still occupying an incredibly important, vital place on paper, while practically remaining largely, publicly unavailable for any senior constitutional support. She firmly placed the chart flat on the table, tapped that specific section once with her finger, and looked directly, piercingly at Edward. The crown absolutely cannot discover its structural weaknesses only after the emergency officially begins. That devastating, profound sentence survived her death. Edward carried the heavy weight of it with him for years. But here is the absolute crucial distinction that must be made. Elizabeth ordered a thorough, cautious review of the system. She absolutely did not order a ruthless family purge. She wanted various legal alternatives examined incredibly carefully after her eventual death, absolutely not forced into place immediately while she was alive. However, someone operating deep within the bureaucracy treated that highly cautious preliminary instruction as absolute permission to go significantly, aggressively further. Charles eventually discovered this massive overreach, and exactly when he did, his usual polite restraint completely gave way to furious confrontation. He aggressively summoned Edward to his office. Absolutely no secretaries allowed, absolutely no officials present, absolutely no prepared PR language. The king desperately wanted a raw, honest family answer long before a dry constitutional one. Had his mother truly explicitly wanted this massive, permanent change, or had her private, preliminary concerns been cynically transformed and weaponized after her death into something she would absolutely never, ever have fully approved? Charles angrily demanded extreme precision. He wanted to know exactly, specifically, what Elizabeth had personally authorized, and exactly where later ambitious advisors had deliberately gone far beyond her original instruction. Edward drew a very hard, incredibly clear line between the late monarch's original, pragmatic continuity concerns and the massive, broader legal settlement that was aggressively developed afterward by bureaucrats. Elizabeth merely asked for institutional weaknesses to be closely studied. She absolutely did not personally sign or authorize the final sweeping arrangement that was now completely reshaping the family hierarchy. The king's famous restraint began to visibly crack. He angrily accused his cousin of actively allowing his mother's sacred name to carry the immense moral weight of a massive decision she absolutely never approved in its finished, brutal form. Edward absolutely didn't look away from the king's anger. He firmly told the sovereign that once the massive implementation process had begun, actively hiding the truth would have damaged the crown significantly more deeply than simply confirming it. Then, Edward gave Charles a highly specific detail he absolutely hadn't expected to hear. Anne had actually fiercely argued against automatically advancing her own branch during the highly private initial review. She had explicitly, loudly warned that absolutely any change appearing to personally reward her while simultaneously publicly weakening Andrew's innocent daughters would completely, irrevocably poison all family trust. That stunning revelation completely forced the king to rapidly reconsider his sister's true role in the mess. She had certainly known discussions existed, yes, but she had actively, forcefully tried to slow down the very outcome that was now placing her directly at the absolute center of the media storm. Charles abruptly rose from his chair before Edward had even finished speaking. He took several agitated steps away, stopped abruptly, then slowly turned back. His voice was significantly quieter now, which made the specific question infinitely more dangerous. Then tell me exactly whose decision I am currently defending. The honest answer was incredibly uncomfortable for a reigning monarch to hear. The final aggressive push had absolutely not come during Elizabeth's reign at all. It closely followed a brand new, highly classified security and continuity assessment conducted entirely after Charles himself became sovereign. When top advisors officially concluded that the old, outdated emergency structure no longer matched the family's actual working reality, someone highly placed inside the king's own administrative system actively transformed a cautious, theoretical royal concern into formal, binding legal machinery. The answer absolutely didn't lead back to Elizabeth, the heir, Anne, or Edward. It led directly into the faceless, bureaucratic machinery surrounding the crown itself. Royal families certainly create the highly visible faces of the monarchy, but true constitutional survival depends entirely on shadowy people whose names almost rarely appear beside crowns. By the time Charles exhaustively examined the full, documented chain of command behind the new succession settlement, he discovered something deeply, profoundly unsettling about his own power. The massive change hadn't emerged from one single, dramatic, easily reversible command. It had been meticulously, slowly assembled through dense legal advice, complex continuity planning, vague family consultation, and extreme political caution, until a radical proposal, once considered almost entirely unthinkable, had become incredibly difficult for the sovereign himself to easily reverse. Charles instantly felt the frustrating limits of his own supposedly absolute position. The legal line of succession was absolutely not something a single royal, even a king, could simply rewrite on a whim with a pen. Any true lasting change strictly required constitutional and parliamentary authority, explicitly meaning that formal law and government approval had to actively stand directly behind the crown's private wishes. That distinction mattered immensely, because Edward had absolutely never been the legal author of the new controversial order. His specific limited role was merely to officially confirm and authenticate what had already been legally agreed upon by the government, giving the new arrangement the necessary veneer of family legitimacy without personally creating it. The king found that bureaucratic explanation almost harder to accept than a betrayal. He had inherited the massive crown, yet now shockingly discovered that massive, binding commitments had been actively coordinated completely around him long before he fully understood exactly how far they had progressed. Charles could angrily question the reasoning, fiercely challenge the timing, and demand endless explanations, but reversing the massive machinery was absolutely no longer as simple as just issuing another royal command. The sovereign was undeniably powerful, but the massive system surrounding him had already begun irreversibly moving. Anne, meanwhile, felt completely trapped for an entirely different reason. Absolutely every written justification she read for the change seemed to point directly back to her own flawless record. Officials loudly praised her uninterrupted service, her absolute reliability during incredibly difficult years, and her unwavering willingness to accept highly demanding duties completely without complaint. The Princess Royal deeply understood exactly why those specific facts mattered immensely during dry emergency planning, but absolutely each and every compliment now felt exactly like weaponized evidence being actively used against Andrew's vulnerable branch. What looked exactly like high praise on official paper felt dangerously, uncomfortably close to a massive personal reward at someone else's expense. She read the thick justification document alone and reached the specific sentence describing her as the most dependable senior family figure outside the direct line. She stopped reading. She violently closed the folder before even finishing the page. She had spent decades painstakingly earning that exact reputation, yet in this specific, agonizing moment, she almost desperately wished it carried significantly less weight. Edward finally quietly explained to the family exactly why he had initially delayed his public confirmation of the new order. He genuinely feared the ravenous public would immediately strip away absolutely every boring constitutional detail and aggressively turn the complex decision into something significantly simpler and infinitely uglier, a direct, vindictive strike against Andrew. One sibling triumphantly rising as another publicly fell in disgrace. The Duke had desperately hoped that more time might somehow soften that harsh interpretation. Instead, his prolonged silence had only delayed the inevitable explosion. Charles now deeply understood the danger they faced. Faceless officials saw necessary continuity and solved a burden. Edward saw a massive family fracture waiting to happen, and when the final, cold notice reached Andrew's side of the family, that exact fear instantly became a devastating reality. While bureaucrats saw continuity, one side of the family was about to experience the exact same decision as a brutal public rejection. The constitutional language sounded entirely clinical. The human family consequences were absolutely anything but. When the revised, formal arrangement finally reached Andrew's side of the family, decades of incredibly complicated loyalty suddenly violently collapsed into a single painful message. Their place had permanently changed. For Beatrice and Eugenie, the deep wound was especially sharp and unfair, because neither woman had actively created the massive controversies surrounding their disgraced father. Yet, they now faced a massive public story in which a cold institutional judgment threatened to look exactly like a targeted judgment on them personally. Beatrice understood immediately exactly why the decision hurt so deeply. Andrew's forced withdrawal from public royal life had already massively changed his family's daily relationship with the working monarchy. That painful distance had been steadily growing, but his incredibly loyal daughters had continued trying desperately to preserve their personal ties with Charles and Anne, fiercely refusing to let one man's catastrophic downfall destroy absolutely every family bond around them. Now, the new, unyielding arrangement threatened to make that painful separation feel absolutely permanent. Eugenie quietly shared the deep humiliation, but Beatrice bravely carried the very first confrontation. She pointedly asked exactly why her own innocent children should inherit the toxic symbolism of terrible decisions they had absolutely never made. The question was absolutely not about demanding royal power. It was entirely about belonging and dignity. Her profound fear was simple and painful. Once the family publicly accepted that one branch could be casually moved aside for purely practical reasons, the fickle public might easily begin treating absolutely everyone connected to that branch as significantly less important, entirely less trusted, and somehow inherently responsible for a massive scandal they absolutely did not create. Anne absolutely refused to let sterile palace aides deliver the highly emotional explanation to her nieces. She contacted her niece directly herself. The Princess Royal intimately knew that a formal, written message would sound incredibly cold and dismissive, and she also deeply knew Beatrice deserved to hear directly from her that the change had absolutely never been designed as a malicious punishment. During the incredibly tense call, Anne gently explained that she had formally, legally objected to any specific wording that could possibly be interpreted as condemning Andrew's descendants. She desperately wanted the cold, constitutional decision entirely separated from the personal dignity of his innocent daughters. Beatrice listened silently without interrupting. Then came several long, agonizing seconds of dead silence. Would you have stopped it if you actually could? Anne did absolutely not answer immediately. Edward later quietly admitted in a documented private conversation that he had very nearly refused to confirm the massive arrangement for exactly this specific reason. The Duke had deeply feared that cold legal planning would inevitably become massive family pain, and now he was helplessly watching that exact prediction unfold. He had genuinely believed the crown desperately needed clarity. He had absolutely not expected that clarity to cut so incredibly steeply. Beatrice finally agreed to meet Anne privately. Absolutely no aides allowed, absolutely no prepared PR language, absolutely no dry constitutional explanation standing between them. That specific meeting would completely change the emotional direction of the entire crisis. Anne's honest answer would matter infinitely more than absolutely any constitutional argument, because exactly what came next would absolutely not be decided by palace machinery, but by two women trying desperately to decide whether their family loyalty could possibly survive what the crown had already done to them. For the very first time since Edward's shocking confirmation, the crisis completely stopped being about abstract positions on a succession chart. Anne and Beatrice met privately, entirely without courtiers speaking for them, and entirely without officials carefully explaining exactly what the monarchy required. One woman had apparently gained massive status, the other appeared to have permanently lost it, yet, when the heavy door finally closed, absolutely neither spoke like bitter rivals. What followed stripped the entire, messy controversy down to its absolute most painful, undeniable truth. They were family long before they were constitutional symbols. Anne spoke first because she deeply knew that silence had already done enough terrible damage. She gently told her niece that she had absolutely never, ever asked for advancement, had absolutely never requested that her own descendants be moved ahead, and had absolutely never treated the legal settlement as a personal reward. Beatrice listened incredibly carefully. The princess deeply understood that succession rank strictly meant a person's formal, legal place in the order surrounding the crown, but her deep fear had completely moved beyond the rank itself. What truly hurt was the terrifying suggestion that her entire branch of the family had become completely expendable simply because Andrew's public position had totally collapsed. Beatrice finally, bravely said exactly what she had been holding back. She vulnerably admitted that when the devastating decision first reached her, she genuinely believed Anne must have quietly, eagerly supported it behind the scenes. From the outside looking in, the logic looked brutal but incredibly simple. The Princess Royal had served faithfully for decades. Andrew had completely fallen from public life. And now one branch triumphantly rose while the other slipped backward in disgrace. The niece could easily see exactly why the crown made the cold calculation. She simply could absolutely not understand exactly why basic family loyalty seemed to completely disappear inside that calculation. Anne leaned forward intensely. She completely refused to let the heavy accusation sit between them. I would absolutely never ask the crown to diminish you in order to elevate me. The princess fiercely told Beatrice that Andrew's massive mistakes absolutely could not be allowed to define his daughters, and she had made that exact unyielding position explicitly clear to Charles. She had specifically, forcefully asked the king to intentionally preserve highly meaningful ceremonial and family recognition for both Beatrice and Eugenie, even long after the succession arrangement permanently changed. Beatrice's deep anger finally began to soften. A documented account of the highly private meeting later recorded that Anne had aggressively pressed Charles to completely separate constitutional planning from personal punishment. Ceremonial recognition, meaning the highly visible public roles and prestigious family honors that do absolutely not themselves determine succession, could still heavily protect their dignity even when the formal legal order shifted. That specific distinction mattered immensely to Beatrice because it told her something she absolutely desperately needed to hear. She had absolutely not been erased from the family. Beatrice made her own incredibly mature decision before the meeting officially ended. She would absolutely not publicly challenge the new settlement. The princess deeply knew that a messy legal or public fight could instantly turn a private, painful wound into a massive national spectacle and forcibly force relatives onto bitterly opposing sides. Anne accepted that difficult choice with quiet, immense relief. Inside the family, the incredibly high temperature finally fell, but beyond the heavy palace gates, Edward's astonishing confirmation was about to become something vastly, uncontrollably larger. By the very next morning, the private family pain had become a massive national spectacle. Edward's confirmation entirely dominated every news broadcast, absolutely every newspaper cover, and endless conversations far beyond polite royal circles. Some pundits interpreted the bold move as ruthless, necessary modernization of a bloated institution. Others saw it as a long overdue, massive recognition of Anne's extraordinary, unparalleled service. But the absolute most powerful, visceral public reaction centered entirely on Beatrice and Eugenie. Two women now unfairly caught inside a massive constitutional drama they had absolutely never chosen. One highly specific image outside Buckingham Palace perfectly captured the strange, potent mixture of public fascination, deep sympathy, and absolute disbelief. Charles nervously watched the reaction gather massive speed. Constitutional commentators accurately described the development as one of the absolute most significant sweeping adjustments to the monarchy's wider succession structure in a generation. They also heavily stressed an incredibly important distinction. Edward had officially confirmed the arrangement, but he had absolutely not created it alone. His massive authority came from age, vast experience, and family standing, but the actual constitutional machinery behind the massive change involved a much wider bureaucratic process. That dry explanation technically mattered, yet it did absolutely little to calm the massive emotional storm brewing in the press. Anne absolutely hated the screaming headlines almost immediately. Several publications aggressively framed the princely how dangerous that specific language could quickly become. Her advancement was being loudly celebrated, while Beatrice and Eugenie were being cruelly treated as pathetic symbols of decline, and the very woman at the absolute center of the supposed victory felt absolutely no victory at all. Public sympathy rapidly shifted strongly toward the two sisters. Beatrice had bravely chosen absolutely not to challenge the settlement. Eugenie stayed equally, dignifiedly restrained, but that profound silence only made the massive human costs significantly more visible to the public. The national debate rapidly moved completely beyond Andrew's toxic controversies and focused increasingly on whether innocent daughters should legally and publicly carry the massive emotional weight of their father's downfall. Suddenly, the entire story was absolutely no longer about dry hierarchy alone. It was entirely about fundamental fairness. Edward finally responded to the growing uproar through a tightly controlled, pre-recorded statement. The Duke heavily stressed that the new arrangement had been designed entirely around necessary continuity, absolutely not punishment, and that absolutely no branch of the family should be treated as personally disgraced by it. His official clarification was incredibly careful, but outside Buckingham Palace, raw emotion had already entirely overtaken caution. A massive crowd gathered while television crews reported continuously from the gates. One major morning paper brutally carried Edward's portrait directly beneath the massive words, "Succession Shock," with significantly smaller, contrasting photographs of Anne and Beatrice deliberately placed on opposite sides. That single, manipulative front page instantly turned a highly complex royal decision into a deeply painful, simplistic public image, one woman triumphantly rising, another appearing to tragically fall. Charles saw the broadcast and immediately, viscerally understood the massive danger. The king aggressively reached for the remote, violently turned off a loud debate about Anne and Andrew, and looked sharply toward a senior aide. "We will absolutely not leave them with that specific version of events." The monarch had one final, fleeting chance to decide exactly what Britain would permanently remember. The dry constitutional change itself, or the toxic family meaning maliciously assigned behind it. The final, definitive answer did not come through yet another targeted leak or another dramatic, explosive revelation. It came precisely when Charles deliberately gathered the specific people most deeply wounded by the massive change and made the monarchy's ultimate position absolutely unmistakable. Edward had formally confirmed the new order. Anne had fiercely refused to treat it as a personal victory. Beatrice had bravely chosen dignity over a messy public confrontation, and the king now fully, deeply understood that the ultimate survival of the crown depended absolutely not merely on coldly deciding who stood exactly where, but on ensuring that constitutional necessity absolutely never became public emotional cruelty. Charles formally, officially accepted the settlement, rather than dangerously reopening the entire dispute. The king deeply knew that attempting to reverse because the massive arrangement had already moved irreversibly through legal, family, and constitutional channels. However, ceremonial roles, meaning highly visible public duties and prestigious family honors that could preserve a royal's visible, respected place without ever changing the formal legal succession structure, gave the monarch one final, powerful way to strongly protect their dignity, even when he could absolutely no longer undo the legal decision itself. Edward fully understood exactly what his confirmation had caused. The Duke had essentially forced a hidden, bureaucratic arrangement into the glaring open, and the ugly truth had deeply hurt people he had spent a lifetime serving beside. Yet, he also firmly believed that continuing the silence would have ultimately been far worse. In a documented, highly private conversation with Anne, he explicitly explained that Queen Elizabeth's deeper, original concern had absolutely never been about rewarding one child and maliciously punishing another. The late Queen had worried profoundly about whether a sense of duty would remain strong enough to survive massive scandal, clashing personality, unexpected illness, and the inevitable passage of generations. Anne gracefully accepted that explanation, but she fiercely, absolutely refused to let her newly strengthened position become a toxic symbol of triumph. The princess told Charles directly and unequivocally that she would absolutely never celebrate at the direct expense of Beatrice or Eugenie. Her massive responsibility had increased. Her personal pride absolutely had not. She desperately wanted her nieces fiercely protected from the toxic idea that Andrew's downfall had somehow become their miserable inheritance. Charles then addressed the two sisters entirely privately. He honestly, vulnerably acknowledged that difficult decisions designed strictly to protect the massive monarchy could still deeply wound the actual people living inside it. Beatrice listened incredibly carefully, while Eugenie finally heard the solid assurance she had been desperately waiting for. Both women would absolutely retain highly meaningful family recognition and appropriate visible ceremonial roles. Their father's catastrophic collapse would absolutely not be allowed to erase their own rightful place. The king looked first at Anne, then directly at Beatrice. His final, echoing words ended the bitter argument with unmistakable force. Absolutely no constitutional arrangement, he said, would ever be permitted to turn relatives into enemies. Edward's confirmation had ultimately changed significantly more than an archaic order of names on a list. It had brutally exposed the massive price the monarchy constantly pays whenever abstract duty and real blood pull violently in completely different directions. Anne emerged with vastly greater responsibility. Absolutely not victory. Beatrice and Eugenie lost expected constitutional ground, but absolutely not their vital place within the family itself. Charles agonizingly accepted that protecting the massive crown sometimes demanded incredibly painful, brutal choices, and that protecting the actual people inside it demanded something infinitely harder. Genuine compassion after the cold decision had already been made. The monarchy ultimately survived the shock because absolutely nobody was allowed to mistake cold, constitutional necessity for malicious personal revenge. And honestly, the undeniable fact that they still won't just clearly answer the question about exactly who aggressively pushed this through the bureaucracy in the first place is the truly weirdest part of the entire saga. Somewhere deep inside the massive machinery, someone highly ambitious decided that a highly cautious review from a late queen was absolute permission to aggressively reshape the family's entire internal order. That specific person's name has absolutely not been confirmed, and until it is, this entire story isn't really fully over. It's just quietly waiting for the very next explosive confirmation.